Interesting. It's like a covert manipulation tactic. If we're observing these kinds of nonverbal cues in others, especially people in positions of power, how should we react? How do we adapt? Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we are going to be exploring the often hidden forces that shape human behavior, yours and mine, and how we can use that knowledge to understand not just ourselves, but everyone around us a bit better.
That's right. And our guide on this journey is Robert Greene and his work, The Laws of Human Nature.
Which is quite a fascinating book. We're going to be kind of sifting through and selecting some of the most interesting and practical insights from it.
Yeah, the goal here is to really give our listeners kind of a more practical lens. Not a purely academic dive into psychology, but like, how do we actually take these ideas and apply them to our daily lives?
Exactly. So we're going to be looking at things like how emotions influence our choices, those innate kind of tribal instincts that we all seem to have, the masks that we put on for different social situations, all that good stuff.
And of course, the wild world of irrationality, because as much as we like to think we're these perfectly rational beings, there's a lot going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, a lot more than we like to admit, right?
Yeah.
So for all of you listening, I hope you walk away from this deep dive with a clearer sense of what really drives your actions and, perhaps even more importantly, a better grasp of the motivations of those around you. And who knows, maybe you'll pick up a few techniques to navigate those tricky social situations.
And the less we're blindsided by events, the more we can truly embrace that unpredictable nature of human behavior, right?
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Let's get started. And one of the most striking things that Greene talks about is this concept of the illusion of rationality. Like, we all like to think that we are these logical creatures, making calculated decisions. But the reality, according to Greene, is actually quite a bit different.
Very different. Just think back to Pericles, the Athenian statesman. He made this observation about the politicians of his time. Each one thought their actions were perfectly logical.
Of course.
They all had these goals and these plans. But when you zoom out and you look at the collective effect of their decisions, it was chaos. And it ultimately led to Athens' downfall. Pericles saw that beneath those seemingly logical choices were actually these strong emotions. Yeah. The lust for power, the hunger for attention, the constant pursuit of wealth that were driving the car.
It's like that hidden engine we don't want to acknowledge.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And this kind of brings us to what Greene refers to as high-grade irrationality. So explain that a little bit.
So high-grade irrationality is, it's basically how those everyday emotions that we all experience, right? Like anger, excitement, resentment, suspicion, they can become so intense that they take over.
Right.
It's like you're being hijacked by your feelings. Think about a time when you were really, truly angry. Like, did logic really have a strong hold on you in that moment?
Probably not. I was probably being a jerk, honestly.
Exactly. We've all been there.
Right.
And it's in those moments, in those kind of reactive states, that we make impulsive choices. We say things we regret.
We do things we regret.
We maybe chase risky obsessions, or we make a really greedy decision. So the first step really is recognizing when this emotional hijacking is happening.
Right.
As soon as you feel that kind of takeover,
right,
that's when you can start to take back control.
It's like our emotions can sometimes flip a switch and suddenly, the rational part of our brain is offline.
Yep.
And it's not just our own emotions that can mess with our judgment. Our sources also discuss something called conviction bias.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So tell us about that.
So conviction bias is basically this tendency that we have to be really swayed by strong beliefs, especially when they're presented with, a lot of conviction, a lot of certainty. Think about it. If someone speaks with absolute confidence,
right,
they use those dramatic gestures, unwavering tone, we naturally think, well, they must know what they're talking about.
They must have done their homework, yeah.
Yeah, right. But on the flip side, if someone expresses nuance or they seem to hesitate, we might see them as less credible, even if their ideas are actually, more sound, more logical. And this makes us vulnerable to those super persuasive types.
Yeah, like salespeople.
Salespeople, absolutely. Or, some charismatic figure, a politician who can just project that sense of certainty.
Even if they're full of it, right?
Even if their ideas are actually terrible.
Exactly.
So we got to be careful about that.
Yeah. And, another point that Greene brings up is how pressure can really reveal a lot about a person, right?
Absolutely. When the heat is on, when we're stressed or we feel threatened, our more primitive brain takes over. It's like all those carefully constructed layers of logic and reasoning, they just kind of poof, gone.
Yeah.
And suddenly we're reacting in these more basic, sometimes not so flattering ways.
Yeah. Like the mask slips a little.
Exactly. And it's not just us. It happens to everyone.
Yeah.
So watching how people act when the stakes are high, that's when you can get a real glimpse of their true character.
It's a good point, a good point. In a world where people can kind of put on a front, seeing how they react under pressure, that's telling.
Absolutely. It reveals those vulnerabilities, those flaws that they might normally keep hidden.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really interesting stuff. But, this kind of begs the question, how do we as individuals navigate this world full of, this inherent irrationality? Like, what's the approach?
Well, it's all about finding that balance, right? Between skepticism and curiosity.
Okay.
So skepticism means we're not just accepting things at face value, we're questioning motives,
Right.
looking for evidence, demanding results. But too much skepticism, well, that can close our minds off to new ideas, to growth. We also need to nurture our curiosity, being open to new perspectives, exploring possibilities. It's about being discerning, but not cynical, questioning, but still receptive.
It makes sense. It's like being open to learning, but not being naive.
Exactly. You got to have both.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another really interesting aspect of human nature that Greene covers: the law of narcissism and the crucial role of empathy.
Ah, yes. This one is a bit jarring for some people, but I think it's important to understand. So the idea here is that we are all, to some extent, naturally self-absorbed.
Self-absorbed, yeah.
We're focused on our own needs and our own perceptions, and this narcissism, as Greene calls it, can really hinder our ability to connect with others.
To really see things from their point of view.
Exactly. And that's where empathy comes in. It's the ability to step outside of ourselves, to understand and share the feelings of another person. It allows us to see beyond our own little world, to grasp other people's moods, their thoughts, to anticipate their actions.
Like tuning into their frequency.
Exactly. And the beauty of empathy is that it helps lower resistance.
Yeah.
People are more open to us when they feel understood.
And, thinking about this, the story of Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic expedition comes to mind.
Oh, fantastic example.
His ability to keep his men alive through those just unbelievably harsh conditions. It wasn't just about him barking orders.
No.
It was about his deep understanding of their emotions. He was attuned to each man's individual needs, and, he would tailor his interactions accordingly.
He really understood the emotional landscape of his crew. Like, one example, he actually volunteered to kill the cook's pet cat.
Oh, wow.
Because they needed to conserve food. And in another instance, he adjusted the workload of the physicist to keep his morale up. Shackleton, he was a master of seeing and valuing each person's experience, and that's what made him such a remarkable leader.
So it's really like this whole idea of effective interaction, whether you're a leader or just, navigating daily life, hinges on truly understanding the people around you. And a big part of that is what Greene refers to as playing a role.
Yes. We are all constantly adapting our behavior, our tone of voice, even our body language to fit different social situations and the people we're interacting with.
Right, like how you act with your buddies is probably different from how you act in a meeting with your boss.
Exactly. These are the roles we play. And the book suggests that those who can't do this, who are just kind of rigidly blunt all the time, they risk being misunderstood or even ostracized.
It's like they're missing those subtle social cues.
Yeah, they haven't learned to read the room, so to speak.
And a key part of reading the room, as you said, is paying attention to nonverbal cues, right?
Absolutely. Our sources emphasize that there's a wealth of information in those nonverbal signals.
So it's like body language, facial expressions, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Like a fleeting look of displeasure, a change in tone. Those can reveal someone's true feelings even before they say anything.
Even before they're consciously aware of it, maybe.
Possibly, yeah. And on the flip side, if someone leans in, mirrors your posture, nods their head, maintains eye contact that shows engagement, agreement, comfort.
It's like they're unconsciously saying, I'm with you.
Exactly. Greene even talks about synchrony, which is this fascinating thing where when people are really connecting, their movements and even breathing patterns start to mirror each other.
Wow, I never really thought about that.
Yeah, it's like an unconscious dance that happens when true rapport is established.
So our bodies can actually kind of betray our true feelings or reveal a connection even when we're not saying it outright.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that these nonverbal cues can also be used in manipulative ways.
Oh, how so?
Greene talks about the symptom.
The symptom.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain.
So this is something you might see in close relationships where one partner develops, say, an ailment, or maybe they start exhibiting negative behaviors, as a way to assert dominance.
Oh, so it's like a power play.
Yeah, it's subtle, often unconscious, but it forces the other partner to cater to their needs, their weaknesses.
To kind of like take care of them.
Exactly. It's a way to gain control and attention.
Interesting. It's like a covert manipulation tactic.
Right. It can be, yeah. But remember, it's not always intentional. It's often driven by deeper insecurities.
Right. So if we're observing these kinds of nonverbal cues in others, especially people in positions of power, how should we react? How do we adapt?
Well, it's about being strategic. If you see someone who seems overly anxious, maybe their laughter is forced or they're overly aggressive.
So you're saying like their insecurity is kind of leaking out.
Yeah, in those cases, you might be able to play to those insecurities, but in the long run, it's probably best to avoid getting too close. Now, for those who are not yet in power but who are clearly ambitious, it depends on their trajectory. Aligning yourself with someone who's a rising star, who has genuine confidence and positive energy, that can be beneficial.
But steer clear of the petty tyrants in the making.
Exactly. Those who crave attention but don't really have anything of value to offer.
Good advice. Now let's talk about something a little more mysterious. The power of the shadow.
Ah, yes. The shadow. This is a concept from Jungian psychology that Greene really dives into.
So what exactly is this shadow?
It's basically the collection of all those repressed, darker aspects of our personality.
So the stuff we don't like to admit to ourselves. Or to others.
Exactly. The traits, desires, impulses that we've been taught to hide, to deny.
Because they're not socially acceptable?
Right. Maybe they're frowned upon by our family, our friends, society in general.
So we kind of shove them down into the basement of our psyche.
Yeah, we create this kind of hidden self. But the thing is, the shadow doesn't just disappear. It's always there, lurking beneath the surface.
Waiting for its moment to emerge.
Exactly. And it often emerges during times of stress, or when deep emotional wounds are triggered.
And I think Greene also points out that as we age, the shadow can become more pronounced.
Yeah, as we get older, we might get tired of keeping up appearances. We might have less energy for those social masks, and so the shadow starts to leak out.
It's like we're less concerned with hiding our flaws.
Maybe. Or maybe we just have less control over them.
It's an interesting idea. So how does understanding the shadow, both in ourselves and in others, help us navigate our interactions?
Well, first of all, it helps us see people as they truly are. We're acknowledging that everyone has a shadow.
We're seeing the full picture, the good and the bad.
Exactly. And that allows us to anticipate their behavior more accurately, especially in tough situations. We understand their hidden motivations.
So we're less likely to be blindsided.
Right. We know that even the nicest person has a dark side. And understanding that helps us avoid being dragged down by their self-destructive tendencies.
Yeah, it's like having a bit of an early warning system.
In a way, yes. And there are ways to decipher someone's shadow. You can look for contradictory behavior, for example.
What do you mean?
Well, sometimes people who overemphasize certain positive traits might actually be compensating for the opposite.
So like someone who's super confident might actually be deeply insecure.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to convince themselves as much as they're trying to convince everyone else.
It's like that over-the-top, almost aggressive niceness that you sometimes see.
Yes, that's a good example. Or the person who's always boasting about their achievements.
When maybe they haven't achieved that much.
Right. The exaggeration itself can be a clue.
It's a good point. And what about this rigid rationalist that Greene describes? What's their shadow like?
So the rigid rationalist, they're the ones who are extremely uncomfortable with anything that seems irrational.
So like emotions, intuition, that sort of thing.
Yeah. They cling to logic, data, facts. They deny that part of themselves that's messy and unpredictable.
It's like they've built this fortress of rationality to keep their own emotions at bay.
In a way, yes. But of course, we're all irrational beings.
Right. So even the rigid rationalist has a shadow where those repressed impulses reside.
Absolutely.
And speaking of shadows, Greene also talks about recognizing certain toxic types.
Ah, yes. These are the folks whose shadow aspects tend to manifest in really harmful ways.
So like red flags to watch out for.
Exactly. Greene outlines a few. One is the insecure master. This is the person who's constantly in conflict with others, always seeing themselves as the victim, blaming everyone else for their problems.
They seem to attract drama.
They do. And they hold grudges. They can be vengeful.
Yikes. Not someone you want to cross.
Definitely not. Then there's the drama magnet. This is the person who thrives on chaos.
So like they're always in the middle of some kind of emotional whirlwind.
Exactly. And they often play the victim, to get sympathy and attention. It's like they need the drama to feel alive.
And what about the moralizer? What are they like?
The moralizer, they often have a secret attraction to the very things they condemn in others.
So it's like a kind of hypocrisy.
Yeah, and they tend to judge others harshly while lacking self-awareness. They can be very rigid in their thinking.
Got it. So those are definitely personality patterns to be aware of. Now let's move on to another big idea in Greene's work: the myth of total control and the importance of accepting our inherent character.
Yes, this law suggests that our fundamental character, those deep-seated tendencies, those patterns that we repeat, it's shaped by forces that are often beyond our conscious awareness.
So you're saying we're not always in control of our own actions?
To some extent, yes. Think of it like a program that's running in the background, influencing our choices.
It's like our own personal autopilot.
Yeah, and this autopilot can be hard to override. It compels us to make the same mistakes, to fall into the same traps.
So our fate is determined by our character.
Not entirely, but it certainly plays a role. And it's linked to another inherent aspect of our psychology, that grass is always greener syndrome.
Oh, I know that one well.
We all do. It's this constant yearning for something more, something different. It drives innovation, but it also leads to dissatisfaction.
It's like we're always chasing the next best thing.
Exactly. And Greene points out that people are often more motivated by desire than by actual possession.
So the chase is more exciting than the catch.
Exactly. The trick is to keep that desire alive, to introduce an element of surprise, of withdrawal, to keep the flame burning.
That's a good point. And then there's our tendency towards short-term thinking, right?
Oh yeah, that's a big one. And Greene argues that this short-term focus is hardwired into us.
It's like an evolutionary leftover from when we had to worry about, being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly. Back then, focusing on immediate threats and rewards was essential for survival. But in today's world, it can lead us astray. We miss the big picture. We make decisions that feel good in the moment, but have negative long-term consequences.
And the classic example of this is the South Sea bubble, right?
Yes. John Blunt, the mastermind behind that scheme, he was so focused on pumping up the stock price, he didn't consider the wider economic impact.
He was playing a short-term game.
He was, and it ended in disaster. It's a reminder that long-term thinking is a skill we have to cultivate. It doesn't come naturally.
It takes effort, conscious effort.
It does.
Okay, now let's talk about something a little more, manipulative, the art of influence, specifically how to influence someone by confirming their self-opinion.
Oh, this is a powerful one. Greene points out that directly challenging someone's self-opinion is almost always a recipe for disaster.
So, telling someone they're wrong is probably not the best approach.
No, it triggers defensiveness. It makes them dig in their heels. Even subtle hints that you know better can backfire.
So what's the alternative?
The key is to make them feel secure in their own beliefs. You do this by subtly mirroring their values.
So you're showing them that you understand and respect their perspective.
Exactly. You show genuine appreciation for their wisdom. You create warmth. You use humor. And the key here is to be genuine. If you're faking it, people will sense it.
So it's about tapping into real empathy.
Yes. Milton Erickson, the famous psychotherapist, he was a master of this. There's a story about how he worked with a husband who was resistant to divorce. And instead of challenging him head on, Erickson used the husband's own religious beliefs to reframe the situation.
So finding common ground.
Exactly. He suggested the idea of a friendly divorce, something that aligned with the husband's values, and that helped him shift his perspective without feeling attacked.
That's a really subtle approach. Okay, let's talk about something that seems to plague us all. The compulsion toward repetition, and the surprising way that crisis can sometimes lead to freedom.
Yeah, Greene argues that we're all prone to repeating patterns in our lives, especially the negative ones.
It's like we're stuck in a loop.
Yeah, and the early life of Anton Chekhov is a good example of this. His father was cruel. He faced financial hardship.
So these early experiences shaped his later behavior.
They did. But what's fascinating is that Chekhov eventually found a way to break free from those patterns. It was through crisis, though.
So the crisis was actually a catalyst for change.
In a way, yes. He faced disappointment. He is diagnosed with tuberculosis.
And these challenges forced him to reevaluate his life.
They did. He started seeking solitude, embracing vulnerability in his writing, and ultimately he found freedom. It's a reminder that even deeply ingrained patterns can be broken.
But it often takes a significant event to shake things up.
It does. Sometimes we need that push.
Okay. Let's turn our attention now to the importance of self-awareness, specifically our awareness of our own attitudes and biases.
This is crucial because our attitudes shape how we see the world, how we interact with others.
But they're often so ingrained that we don't even realize we have them.
Exactly. So how do we become more aware? Greene suggests we ask ourselves some tough questions. How do we judge people when they're not around? How do we handle adversity? Do we blame others? Do we resist change?
It's about shining a light on those hidden corners of our minds.
It is. And Greene points out the dangers of unchecked negative attitudes, like resentment.
Yeah, resentment can be toxic.
It is. He uses the example of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who became increasingly bitter and isolated as he aged. His resentment led to bad decisions and ultimately his downfall. The antidote to this is to let go of past hurts.
To forgive, to move on.
Exactly. And to cultivate generosity, tolerance, and a sense of responsibility for our own actions.
It's about taking ownership of our own lives.
It is.
Now let's talk about something a little dark. The dark side of our character and how we can actually integrate it into our lives in a healthy way.
The dark side refers to those negative moods, impulses, and behaviors that we all have.
So like our inner demons.
In a way, yes. And often, these dark impulses are linked to the roles we play in society.
The masks we wear.
Exactly. We suppress parts of ourselves to fit in, and that can lead to a buildup of negative energy. The example of Nixon is a good one. His paranoia, his insecurity, it ultimately led to destructive behavior.
So the lesson here is not to try to repress our dark side, but to acknowledge it.
Exactly. We need to bring those impulses into the light of awareness.
To face our demons.
Yes. And once we do that, we can actually start to channel that energy in positive ways.
So like our neediness can become empathy.
Exactly. Or our aggression can become passion for a cause.
It's about transforming that negative energy into something constructive.
Yes. As Henrik Ibsen said, there is no strength that is not also a weakness.
Okay, that leads us to the idea that human behavior is much more nuanced than what we see on the surface.
For most of our interactions are pretty superficial.
We're all polite, we follow social norms.
Yeah, exactly. But beneath that pleasant facade, there's a whole lot going on.
The shadow is always lurking.
It is. And to truly understand people, we need to see them in 3 dimensions. We need to understand their shadow as well as their persona.
We need to see the whole picture.
Yes. And that will help us anticipate their actions, avoid being manipulated, and respond in a way that's both effective and authentic.
Okay, let's talk about a phenomenon that seems to be everywhere these days. The paradox of grandiosity.
So Greene argues that in the past, people had more outlets for their grandiosity. Religion, social movements.
So those were ways to channel that desire for significance.
They were. But in modern society, those outlets have weakened.
And so people turn that energy inward.
Exactly. They create these inflated images of themselves, these illusions of grandeur. And this is especially common among leaders.
So what are some of these illusions that grandiose leaders tend to create?
Well, Greene outlines 6. One is the belief that they are destined for greatness.
So like they have a special destiny.
Exactly. They often fabricate stories about their past to support this belief.
It's all part of creating the myth.
Yes. Then there's the belief that they are exceptional, that they have unique talents and no real flaws.
They have an inflated sense of self.
They do. And then there's the illusion of moral superiority. They judge others harshly, but they're often hypocrites themselves.
So they hold themselves to a different standard.
Exactly. And then there's the common man illusion.
What's that?
This is when leaders, who are often from privileged backgrounds, try to portray themselves as just like everyone else.
So like they're one of the people.
Exactly. It's a way to connect with the masses.
And what about the victim illusion?
This is when leaders blame everyone else for their problems. They refuse to take responsibility.
It's always someone else's fault.
Right. And finally, there's the visionary illusion. These are the leaders who promise grand change, a glorious future, but they rarely have concrete plans.
They're all talk, no action.
Pretty much. So when we encounter these claims of grandiosity, it's important to be skeptical. Look for evidence. Don't get swept up in the rhetoric.
Don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Exactly. And on a personal level, it's important to avoid indulging in these fantasies ourselves.
So like focus on achievable goals.
Yes. Find that state of flow where you're completely absorbed in the work itself.
Where you're making real progress.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's switch gears again and talk about the law of gender rigidity and the importance of reconnecting with our own inner masculine and feminine qualities.
This is an interesting one. Greene argues that we all have both masculine and feminine qualities.
Regardless of our biological sex.
Yes. But society often forces us into these rigid gender roles.
So we suppress parts of ourselves.
We do. And this can limit our creativity, our emotional intelligence, and our relationships.
So the key is to embrace both our masculine and feminine sides.
Exactly, to integrate them. He uses the example of Caterina Sforza, who was a powerful woman in Renaissance Italy. She was a skilled military leader, but she also had a deep appreciation for art and culture.
So she embodied both the masculine and the feminine.
She did. And Greene also talks about the concept of contrasexual attraction.
What's that?
It's the idea that we're often attracted to people who embody the qualities that we ourselves have repressed.
So if we've suppressed our feminine side, we might be drawn to someone who's very feminine.
Exactly. And the goal is to reclaim those lost parts of ourselves, to become more whole, more balanced.
To be our true selves.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to the importance of developing inner authority and finding a sense of purpose in our lives. This is something that Martin Luther King Jr. really embodied.
He had a strong sense of purpose.
He did, and it came from a place of deep inner conviction. During the Montgomery bus boycott, he described feeling this voice of God guiding him.
So like an internal compass.
Exactly. And Greene argues that when we tap into that inner authority, we can neutralize negative emotions, find focus, and unlock creative energy.
It's about becoming the author of our own lives.
Yes, and it starts with finding our calling. What is that one thing that truly resonates with our gifts and passions?
What makes us feel alive?
Exactly. And it's important to distinguish between a true calling and a false purpose. A true purpose leads to growth, contribution, meaning.
Whereas a false purpose can lead us down the wrong path.
It can, like chasing fame or fortune for its own sake.
So how do we find our true calling?
It takes honest self-reflection. Look for patterns in your life, trust your intuition, and seek out wise mentors like Coco Chanel did.
She had a mentor.
Yeah, a man named Arthur Boyd Capel who helped her navigate the business world.
So a mentor can help us clarify our path.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears one last time and talk about the dynamics of social interactions and the role of power. This is where the idea of the court comes in.
The court. Like a royal court.
Yeah. Greene uses the court as a metaphor for any kind of social hierarchy. And he points out that there are certain strategies that people use to gain and maintain influence in these settings.
So like office politics, social circles, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And some of these strategies are, well, pretty manipulative. Like flattery. But not just any flattery. It has to be targeted at the leader's insecurities.
So you have to know your audience.
Yes. And mirroring. Subtly reflecting back the leader's moods and ideas to create a sense of validation.
So it's like you're becoming their echo chamber.
In a way, yes. And then there's subtle self-promotion.
Highlighting your achievements without bragging.
Exactly. And of course, appearance matters. Cultivating a pleasing image is important.
And what about the use of weakness?
That can be a powerful tool too. Appearing vulnerable can elicit sympathy, and it can also make you seem less threatening.
So it's like a way to disarm people.
It can be. And then there's patience. Knowing when to act, when to hold back.
It's about playing the long game.
It is.
Yeah.
And Greene also talks about the role of the jester.
The jester, like the court fool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The jester can use humor to gain favor, but they have to be careful.
It's a delicate balance.
It is. And then there's the mirrorer, who creates a sense of deep understanding in the leader.
It's like they're reflecting back the leader's best self.
Exactly. And beyond these individual strategies, there's also the dynamic of the group enemy.
So like creating an us versus them mentality.
Yes. Having a common enemy can unify a group, but it can also lead to exclusion and persecution.
It's a dangerous game.
It can be. And finally, there's the importance of a shared purpose.
Having a common goal.
Yes, that's what gives a group meaning, direction, and motivation.
So these are all things to be aware of when navigating complex social environments.
Absolutely. Now, let's look at how we judge leaders and how public opinion plays into that, using Queen Elizabeth I as an example. When Elizabeth I became queen, there was a lot of uncertainty.
People didn't know what to expect.
They didn't. And she made some early missteps, like misjudging Mary, Queen of Scots. But she learned from those mistakes. She became more strategic, more decisive.
And she was willing.